It's at the top of the hour, and so I'm very pleased to welcome you to the latest in the series of webinars about implementing and supporting next-generation science standards in the Earth and Space Sciences. I'm Susan Sullivan, and I'm one of several organizers, including Aida Awad and Ed Robeck and John McDaris, who have been providing this webinar series as part of a larger initiative supporting NGSS, Earth and Space Sciences. This is going to be the last of the academic year webinars. The next ones will start back up in the fall, so I'll talk a little bit more about what that's going to look like. Everybody who's here, feel free to put questions and comments into the chat window as our presenter is speaking, and he'll either choose to address your comments in real time, or we'll have those as a record, and we can come back to that during Q&A after the presentation. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Ed Geary. He is our presenter. He is director of the Science, Mathematics, and Technology Education program, which is a model for preparing and supporting K-12 teachers. Ed is located at Western Washington University, and the reason we've asked him here today is to talk about the efforts in Washington to build a very vibrant coalition of stakeholders and organizations, different people who are concerned with science education in Washington State. We know that in order for NGSS to be implemented in such a way as to meet the vision, it's going to take a lot of effort in decision-making at the state and district levels. And so the question here is, what kind of models are there that can support that kind of state-based coalition? I'll tell you a little bit more at the end, but I want to make sure you see this, that we will be starting up in the fall again. So if you are not already on our email list, in order to get notices of when those open up for registration, you can sign up at this link here, and we'll put that in the chat. The two webinars that we have on the dock right now, ready to go, is one led by Michael Weiss session, and that's about, and possibly others, introducing teachers to the next generation science standards in Earth and Space Science for the first time, what works and what kinds of things should you look out for when you're introducing people for the first time, and also a session led by Eric Pyle showing NSTA support tools for next generation science standards. That's coming up. Also, you have hopefully seen notice of the Earth Educators Rendezvous, which is coming up in July for Madison, Wisconsin. There will be workshop programming and papers there about next generation science standards if you'd like to come and continue the conversation there over the summer. I also want to alert you to the abstract deadlines that are coming up for GSA and AGU over the summer. The first one will be July 12th for the Geological Society of America. Watch your email for those if you'd like to submit things about your next generation science standards work or anything else you're doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed and look forward to learning more about what's going on in Washington.
Thanks, Susan, and I want to thank you and John and Ida and Ed and everyone else who's put together this webinar series. Greatly appreciated, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work we're doing here in Washington State. So full disclosure for everybody who's on the call, this will be much about state coalition building and some about the NGSS and some about Earth and Space Science, but a lot of this will be in the context of how Earth and Space Science can be positioned to work with our sister disciplines to actually promote the next generation science standards for the benefit basically of our discipline, but for the benefit of all students who are studying STEM. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge my colleagues from Washington State who have helped with this initiative, Ann Egger and Jenny Duchesne from Central Washington,
University, Stamatis Vokos and Julie Antilla from Seattle Pacific University, Kathy Baldwin and Gus Nolmeyer from Eastern Washington University, Sarah Julien from Whatcom Community College, Ellen Ebert from our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which means the State Department of Education, Jacob Clark Blickenstaff from the Pacific Science Center, Tamara Nelson from Washington State University, Vancouver, Jose Rios from University Washington Tacoma, and Ann Wright Mockler from Pacific Northwest National Labs, and my colleague here at Western, Roxanne Ronca, who's in our math department here. I also won't mention the other 90 people or so because that would take up the entire time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is really a group effort, and for building any type of coalition to promote the NGSS or to promote STEM education, it really requires both strategic leadership and very collaborative leadership. And we have a great group here in Washington who have come together to help put this partnership together. So one of the things I wanted to start off here with is to discuss really why we decided to come together and focus on a collaborative effort to improve STEM teacher preparation. And frankly, we had in our state already organizations, teachers of science, teachers of mathematics, that were already venues for people to come together on a regular basis and talk about science teacher or math teacher preparation. However, I noticed when I came here about 3 years ago that our teachers of science was not actively engaged in a whole lot of work, and what the NGSS have provided is a focus for some of the organizations to do more than have just regular meetings, a real chance to accomplish something. So the NGSS are a vehicle for opportunity for all of us, but it takes a lot of thinking about how you want to take advantage of those opportunities. A lot of what we're doing within the state builds on 20 to 30 years of research and education, both on how people learn, but also about organizational change, and we'll talk a little bit later about Connie and Kramer's work on collective impact. One of the major points I would like people to go away with from this particular webinar is that our theory of change here is that changing one institution at a time and changing one program, i.e. STEM teacher preparation at Western, is less effective than actually collaborating with our colleagues from across the state to share resources and to collaboratively improve all of our programs simultaneously. So with that, we'll kind of launch into this whole webinar. And please feel free to ask questions throughout this. Be glad to answer those. I understand these are intended to be informal, and I will fully support that. So what we'll be doing in the next few minutes is exploring a next-generation vision of K-12 STEM teacher preparation. You'll be learning about our efforts in Washington on this collaborative model that we've been developing. We'll discuss some of the nuts and bolts of building a statewide coalition, and we'll discuss how the earth and space sciences fit into and benefit from all of this. So my assumption is that many of you have seen a diagram or a figure like this. This is from Achieve and from the Next Generation Science Standards. And this is a figure that shows how science education will change with the NGSS. And if you look on the left-hand side, it's more about what will happen less frequently, and on the right about what we hope will happen more frequently. And really the gist of this slide is to discuss moving away from teacher-centered information transfer type of classrooms into active student-centered learning classrooms where students have more ownership of their learning. And of course, this is at the heart of the NGSS. The question is, how do we start moving students from kind of this memorization of facts to this more active engagement and understanding of concepts, of practices, and of cross-cutting issues within the next generation science standards? So that's part of what we'll be doing here, is talking a little bit about how we start to move people along the spectrum here of change. And one of the questions that we asked the group that we got together here in Washington State was, what will it take
to actually move people from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of this diagram. And one of the questions we posed for ourselves, because all of us who came together originally, about 70 of us, excuse me for a second, I'm in the middle of a construction zone here at Western Washington University, so it gets a little noisy. One of the things we were interested in is how we could change our teacher preparation programs to support the implementation of the next generation science standards in local K-12 schools. So once Washington State adopted the standards in 2014, the challenge for many of us in higher ed became, so what do we do about this? And so this diagram helped us to look at what the NGSS are trying to promote and start us thinking along the pathway of how do we start looking at our own programs. And the question we first posed to our folks was, do you think, or how much do you think our STEM teacher preparation programs will change to reflect the intent of the next generation science standards and the Common Core state standards in math and language arts? And this is a multiple choice question, which is A, not at all, B, just a little around the edges, C, quite a bit, but only in a few institutions, and D, a lot and in many institutions. And while, of course, our preferred answer is D, we hope that most of our institutions will change to reflect this. Without a concerted effort with partners from across the state, the likely answer is B, which is just a little around the edges. And we've seen that happen with many educational reforms, and our goal here in Washington State is for that not to occur. So our goal here is to make sure that we actually can support teachers in schools now who are faced with the implementation of the standards with preparing future teachers to go into schools where the standards are a major focus of the learning that is going on. So to do this and to bring people together around this, one of the things that we realized early on is you have to help people suspend their current realities. So one of the challenges we all face is the current day-to-day and the current constraints that we all face in our own programs. So whether it's teacher preparation or some other aspect of teaching and learning, we have our own classes we teach, we have our research we do, we have our families, we have all these other obligations. So the question becomes, how do we make space for and how do we envision a different future for teacher preparation, for example, that is not based on the way we currently do things, and how do we then get there? So one of the ways to do that is to envision the world of 2030. And this actually worked quite well with our group, which was inviting K-12 educators who are recent graduates from our programs, people who've been in teaching for 10, 15, 20 years, a variety of math and science educators from higher ed, from both 2-year and 4-year institutions, State Department of Education folks, business people, informal science educators, all into the same room because all of them had a vested interest in the answer to the question of how do we effectively implement the next generation science standards. But we then allowed people to leave their current realities at the door and to envision the world of 2030. And as we did that, we wanted them to consider this frame, which was a frame of sustainability around the environment, the economy, and society. And we purposely chose this frame because sustainability types of concepts are embedded within the next generation science standards. And it's also resonated with almost everybody in the room, that if we are going to actually think about doing things differently in education and preparing teachers and having students learn, why don't we think about it in this education for sustainability context? So we wanted to frame this in, so what will the world look like in 2030? And if we look at that, we find that the world in 2030 will have approximately 8.2 billion people, with 5 billion of those people living in urban areas. We'll have things like nanobots that will be injected into human bodies to go fight cancers and or viruses that inhabit the body. We will have all sorts of things that we'll be dealing with related to climate change. We will be potentially exploring places like Mars and trying to have colonies on Mars. We'll hopefully be moving towards a carbon-free economy based on renewable energy. We'll also be thinking about what our cities look like with those 5 billion people in them. We'll think about how to feed all those people. And of course, we'll be dealing with things like climate change impacts on oceans and corals and food production. And again, I'll pause for a minute as the truck goes by. There we go. And all of these things are the frame for, this is the world that our students will face graduating in the year 2030. The question becomes, what are the skills and knowledge and dispositions that those students will need to actually successfully navigate and survive and thrive in that type of world? And the second question we posed was, so then what do the teachers of 2030 need to look like? So these are the questions we posed to our group of collaborators, 2 visioning questions. So characteristics, knowledge, skills, dispositions needed by teachers, elementary and secondary. And the question was, are they the same? And what we did was have people break, of course, into groups and look at these types of issues. But what we wanted to do is if we could identify what teachers in 2030 would need, we would then know what our programs would probably need to do and how they would need to change to get to this vision. So one message here from this collaboration building activity is bringing people together, diverse set of stakeholders around building a common vision. And it's got to be a collaborative vision where everybody in the room is able to contribute, because if it's just your vision or my vision and it's not a broad vision, then you're going to have a lot trouble selling that vision back with your colleagues at your own institutions and even more broadly with other people. So as a result of this, we came up with a set of characteristics that we felt that all elementary, middle, and high school teachers should have. And this is a list of those things. And I don't think, if you read this list, I don't think people will generally disagree that we want elementary teachers to be generalists still, but strong understanding of STEM and having some experience in the real-world STEM applications. But we wanted our middle and high school teachers to have deeper content knowledge, stronger pedagogical content knowledge in their areas, and have maybe research and or work experiences. But when you look what we wanted for all teachers, this is where we really get into what we think the intent of the NGSS is, which is to be effective collaborators who are able to co-teach and promote learning across disciplines, not with just one discipline, be three-dimensional teachers. And many of you have started to hear about the NGSS three-dimensional teaching. And if you're like many of us here at Western, you're still going, what does that really look like and what does that mean? But in a sense, it's this aspect of, again, being able to integrate effectively the disciplinary core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts, and the science and engineering practices. The other characteristic that we felt, certainly in our communities and we think across the nation, are the ability to work and connect with diverse families and communities, because our demographics are changing and schools are changing. So these are things that were identified as being core to what we wanted to do. Well, that led us into another set of things, that if these were the characteristics of teachers, then what would our programs need to do around this? So we looked at this and said, you know, what the research tells us is that clinical practice is really important. Having students in classrooms as often and as diverse classrooms as possible helps students learn what it's like to be a teacher and helps them practice the methods and the content that they've learned in their classrooms at college, but apply it in a way on a regular basis with different types of kids, getting to know those kids at the same time. The next thing we wanted to do was not only say, well, it doesn't stop at just having our future teachers go into classrooms. It also is about what happens when they get into their own classrooms. And we know that we lose a lot of teachers during this induction phase, this first 3 years. So how can we strengthen our induction programs? So these were 2 characteristics that we said all of our programs need to really strengthen: our clinical practice and induction programs, including working with K-12 mentors, i.e. cooperating teachers, so that, again, we have K-12 schools that are partnering with us in this, so that our STEM teacher preparation programs reflect an ongoing feedback mechanism with them. We also wanted our disciplinary departments to do a better job in our teacher preparation programs, to do a better job of recruitment. So in many of your states, probably like ours, there's a huge demand in the STEM workforce for well-prepared students coming out into the workforce. And we find it challenging to meet that demand in Washington State, so there's a lot of interest by our legislature in improving the number of students or increasing the number of students coming out into the workforce. So we have a strong motivation to try and figure out how to recruit more teachers into STEM teaching. But I will tell you one of our challenges. Over the last 3 to 4 years, our enrollments in secondary education for STEM have been declining. And that's true across the state. And if you look at trends, it's true in many places across the nation. What we found when we started talking about this was we have kind of let recruitment sort of happen on its own. And what we realized is we need to be much more strategic about recruiting students into STEM education by actively going out and reaching out to science clubs and math clubs in our STEM majors at our institutions, both 2-year and 4-year, and even prior to that as we recruit them to college. So some of the other things that came out of this were that we also had another challenge we realized, was that we have very few classes with our secondary STEM education majors. So we only have 2 or 3 classes with them that actually model the type of pedagogy and learning that we would like them to do as teachers. And they get more of those in their education courses, but they have very few of them in the science or math courses. So one of the things that we realized was important and should be on everybody's radar screen is that we should be thinking about how to engage our colleagues in what active student-centered learning is, why it is so effective compared to traditional information transfer styles of learning, and what models there are to help faculty who often have no training in education prior to coming to college or university. How do you help them start adopting and getting better at those practices themselves? So the goal is actually that our students who become future teachers now have the opportunity to have these things modeled for them in their undergraduate chemistry, biology, geology, physics, mathematics, computer science, engineering, etc. classrooms. So that it's not just the 3 courses in their science education program, but this is the norm. So this is a huge task that was identified as part of changing STEM teacher preparation and improving that. And finally, one of the things we identified was that we need to have a better feedback loop, that we need to be learning organizations, that we need all of us to get out of kind of the isolated modes that we find ourselves in, either as departments or as individual institutions, and find better ways to both partner and get feedback from our partners who are hiring our teachers and having them go into a variety of different settings, and with that feedback, enabling us to continually improve our programs. So those are the types of things that we're hoping to do as we move forward with this coalition. And I see that there's a question here related to, and I'll just pose a thing, I'm just curious here, that there's other efforts going on between higher ed and training teachers in 3-dimensional leadership. So as you have these programs, and if you're working on a different type of partnership or a strengthening partnership, please share those in the chat as we move on, because it'd be really interesting to see who else is involved in coalition building efforts and or partnership efforts in strengthening those efforts with your local schools. So one of the other things, and it gets back to the next generation science standards, is that we all agreed, not surprisingly, that we wanted all of our teachers to understand and be able to use effectively the NGSS and the Common Core State Standards to guide instruction. And that seems like kind of a no-brainer for a webinar like this, but our teachers in our state are finally, even after, this is 2016, after 2 years of knowing we adopted, are just now trying to figure out what that means for them in their classrooms. And so as they start to struggle with and start to implement what they think are NGSS-aligned curricula and teaching practices, our goal now is to figure out how to better support them as individuals and as schools and with our future graduates. The other thing that's on the radar screen that's partly in the NGSS and it's actually in our state standards here in Washington is the need to address computer science and engineering. In the standards, engineering practices are one of the things that have been missing from our preparation of future teachers and from what's going on in K-12 classrooms. Likewise for computer science, and yet when you look at where growth areas are in the STEM workforce, it's these two areas that are the most prominent. So the question is, so how are our programs going to change to reflect those realities and help prepare a future generation of teachers that have skills that may go beyond biology and chemistry or geology into things like biology and mathematics or biology and computer science or physics and engineering, so that, again, we are producing more STEM-like teachers able to be cross-disciplinary in more than one area. Okay? We also, of course, want our teachers to have strong pedagogical content knowledge, and that becomes more challenging when you look at interdisciplinary teaching. What is the pedagogical content knowledge that teachers will need if they are trying to teach more than one subject area? So these are the things that we'll be struggling with over the next few years as we wrestle with what it means to be a STEM teacher and to facilitate learning across multiple disciplinary areas. At the same time, we're trying to have our teachers be more inclusive, understand different types of learners in a more structured and deep way. And so all of those things need to weave together. And finally, we were looking at another component of teacher preparation, which relates to culture and communication and collaboration. And of course, these are the other things that teachers need to know about if they're to be effective in schools. One is that how does your school, how does your community work? How do you work with diverse colleagues in any type of setting? And do you know how to work on a regular basis in a professional learning community? Recognizing that you don't get your teaching degree, go out, and then you're on your own for the next 20 years. You're both working with colleagues at your school, but probably you're working with colleagues in your discipline and or around the state and or around the nation, much like those of us on this call work with our colleagues on a regular basis. So that actually brings us to this sort of aspect of coalition building and this collective impact model for improvement. So again, like I mentioned earlier, this builds on Connie and Kramer's work in 2011 related to collective impact being the recognition that social change, organizational change, does not work very effectively when it's done one institution, one department, one organization at a time. And that the only way in a complex system like education for you to make significant change and progress is to bring together a strategic group of stakeholders around a common agenda and vision that they collaboratively create and support, and that basically you're able then to move that agenda forward over time, measuring progress with common metrics, and supported in an ongoing and sustained way by, quote, a background organization or group. So what it's really said, if you boil this all down to collective impact, is we all win when we collaborate and share and work together much more effectively, and our students win much more readily than if Western decides it's going to create a great new program for all its students, but doesn't really care what Central Washington or Seattle Pacific University or Whatcom Community College are doing. And partly this also reflects the reality of resources are limited. None of us have the people, the time, the resources to do any of this all on our own. And what we found when we came together for our first set of meetings and workshops was that we each had something to share and contribute to this effort, and we had much to benefit from that sharing and collaboration. So our overarching goal for what we're trying to do in the state of Washington here is to improve earth literacy and science learning for all students by supporting changes in our own teacher preparation programs to support the NGSS and the Common Core. If you're not an NGSS or a Common Core adopting state, and almost everybody's a Common Core adopting state, but Most states, even if they haven't adopted the NGSS, are aligning their work with the NGSS. So it provides you a nice lever of opportunity to really look at how you might change things. I will also say that focusing on teacher preparation is a nice, I'd say, part of education to focus on, because you can find a core group of very committed people all dedicated to wanting to do the same thing, which is provide high-quality teachers for all the students in your state. So this is who we are. This slide describes that we are 12 institutions right now, four-year institutions, that represent over 90% of the teacher education institutions in the state. We also have a number of community college faculty involved. In our state, community colleges are not tasked, their mission is not necessarily focused on preparing future teachers, but we get many of our students in STEM from these places, and so we recognize that if we're trying to recruit students into STEM teaching or into STEM workforce, STEM majors, we need to be working very strongly and collaboratively with our community college partners. We also have Western Governors University, and if people aren't all that familiar with Western Governors University, it's a virtual university, so you can get online degrees, including degrees in education and teaching. And so we have formed a partnership with folks there to figure out how this will look and play out as we evolve our own teacher preparation programs. How can we also help this online entity evolve its teacher preparation programs, knowing that its structure is different than many of our brick and mortar type of institutions. We also have several businesses involved, several government agencies, and many non-governmental organizations who are involved in this effort. All of these entities are important to include in the conversation, and we have already come up with some challenges, and I think it's important to share some of those as well as the successes we've had. So one of our challenges is that our disciplines are different. So we have physics and chemistry and biology and geology and mathematics and computer science and engineering, but we don't have enough mathematicians and math educators at our table right now. We don't have enough two-year college faculty at our table right now, and we don't have enough businesses at the table right now who are involved in STEM. So as we move forward over the next 3, 4, 5 years, our goal in the next year is to increase the participation of those types of partners in this process. So, and as Suzanne Metley from Western Governor University has chimed in, WG is a nonprofit, private, fully online institution that includes in-class student teaching. So again, think broadly when you're thinking about these coalitions. So this is what we've accomplished in about a year and a quarter type of time. We held 3 workshops, and I want to thank the folks at CERC and the Integrate project, the NSF-funded STEP project. They gave us seed money to bring people together. We also, I will tell you, we brought people together for one-day workshops. We originally thought we were going to do 2 to 3-day workshops and maximize the time and engagement. We actually found that one-day workshops were what people could afford time-wise, and they turned out to be really a great way to go because it forced us to be really focused for a day at a time on specific outcomes for that particular day. And they were then also low cost because even though we had people from across the state, only a few people needed to stay overnight. Most people could drive and then leave, and it worked out well for many folks. So prior to doing all this work, we conducted a next generation standards analysis. We called it a gap analysis of our science education courses at the different institutions that prepare future teachers. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. We also, out of the work at these 3 workshops, we recognized, well, how do we go from talking and coming up with what future teachers should look like and what the characteristics of our programs should look like to actually actualizing and implementing some of the things that we thought were all really good things to do. And so what we decided was that cross-institutional working groups would be formed around 6 areas of STEM teacher preparation. And those are the ones that are outlined in the colors on this particular slide. So computer science working group, an engineering working group, and a sustainability or education for sustainability working group, and then a clinical practice and induction and a pedagogical content knowledge working group. Because those were the things that all of us agreed we wanted to improve. And some of us had models that we were already doing well in one of those areas and we might be able to share part of our success in our model in that area. And then in other areas, we were interested in what other people were doing and what their models were. And in some cases, like with computer science education and engineering, we recognize we have to partner with people in the business community, in the broader national community, because we don't necessarily have computer science educators or engineering educators on our faculty now who help prepare future teachers, but we're thinking we may need to have those people on board. And then finally, we identified three underlying components for this work. And one was, even if our working groups come up with great things and we're able to do professional development with all our STEM teacher preparation faculty around the state and with K-12 educators who are in partnership with us, et cetera, we have to change our organizations. And we need to recognize where we fit STEM teacher preparation-wise within our organization. So organizational change and how to do that is a fundamental underlying component of the work we're proposing to do. Increasing diversity is another one of those components because that's also of interest and really a mandate for all of us. And then how to build collaborations is another aspect that we're really focusing on with respect to being able to actually implement changes that not only impact our programs and our faculty and our students, but actually can be sustained. So I wanted to briefly return here to this Next Generation Science Standards survey that we did. And the question we posed was, how well do our teacher preparation programs right now in classes prepare pre-service teachers for the NGSS? And what we looked at here was we looked at 5 variables that align with NGSS types of tendencies. And this is a self-report recognized, and we kind of measured the confidence people had in how well their classes align with these different types of characteristics. We did not measure how well our STEM teacher preparation courses prepare teachers for the Common Core state standards in math, something that we're actually looking to do as we move forward. And we didn't measure all these other things around STEM teacher preparation needs. And the upshot of this gap analysis was, and you won't be surprised, that all of us think we do a really good job teaching disciplinary core ideas in our science education courses. We also recognize that almost all of us do a very poor job in teaching about cross-cutting concepts. And what we discovered was it wasn't that they weren't present. It just is that we didn't make them visible in many of our courses to our students. The students didn't recognize them as cross-cutting concepts. And you're wondering, where's the science and engineering practices piece? Well, it's not on this slide, but the reality is people think we're doing well in science practices, and most people think we're not doing anything, basically, or only moderately to weakly in engineering practices because that hasn't been a part of what we do. And of course, there was this correlation with the more familiar I am with the NGSS, and the more I think actually my class is actually implementing those types of things already that reflect the NGSS. So take this for what it's worth, but the lesson here is if you're going to form a coalition to actually change and improve our science education, improve teacher preparation, et cetera, do some background data collection along the way. It really helps you make a stronger case. So these are also then the things we're planning to do in the next 4 years. Full confession, we are in discussions with NSF right now about a potential funding for implementing the types of things we proposed on a large scale. And this is what we hope to do should that funding actually be granted. So we want to make sure we're all on the same page vision-wise and that more people are brought into the vision, into the agenda. One of the things about organizational change is it's not static, it's constantly evolving, and people are coming in and out of it due to various personal reasons and or institutional reasons. So building a broad coalition requires you to continually engage people in your vision and bring their voice to the table. We will be developing through these regional teams, these working groups, set of professional development workshops around those 6 key areas of teacher preparation. Our implementation arms of this project will be regional teams built around 4-year and 2-year institutions around the state who are involved in teacher preparation. But those regional teams will include local K-12 partners, local government agency partners like our educational service districts, local STEM businesses and national labs, etc. We're also going to be creating aligned programs because all of our teacher preparation programs need to be accredited by the state, and we are just going through a process this year of how well our programs align with the NGSS and the Common Core. And right now, I would say that we're only partway there. That it'll take us another year to 2 to truly reflect that alignment, because none of us have much in place right now with respect to computer science, engineering, sustainability, those types of things are embedded with the NGSS. We will also be creating new endorsements in computer science and engineering, i.e., if you want to be a teacher of those things right now, there's no real pathway for you to do that, which is probably why we only have 1 out of 10 high schools offering a computer science or an engineering course, and those are often taught by a knowledgeable, willing person or a consortium of interested, knowledgeable parents, but not by people who've been endorsed in how do you learn computer science in high school or how do you learn engineering. So we'll be developing those. One of the things that we've already found valuable is the sharing of resources. So even with just 3 one-day meetings, we realized how much we had to share with one another and how much we could benefit from that sharing. And we, in those 3 days, I think made a great first step in moving away from seeing our sister institutions as competitors and seeing them as collaborators in this process. And finally, we're going to be looking at how to evaluate and continually improve our program as we move forward over the next 4 years. So a little bit, and I'm almost done here, about the nuts and bolts of coalition building here. Sort of, this is lessons learned. So it's really important when you're starting this process out, and I'll pause here for 30 more seconds while the truck goes by. And they tend to drive really slowly when they go by, just to make it annoying. So it really is important on who you invite to be part of your coalition. And it's really important to think broadly. So for us, focusing on STEM teacher preparation, even though I'm an earth scientist and at my heart of hearts, I'm a revolutionary advocate for earth and space science, i.e. earth systems education, I learned long ago that that's not the best, most productive pathway to go if you really want to promote earth and space science. It's really to partner with other people involved in STEM education writ large, because then you have a whole lot of partners who will advocate along with you. So remember, and in our effort, we needed to involve our other stakeholders. So we needed to involve our K-12 school partners, and we need to involve the state. Several of the things that we are proposing to do will require policy changes at the state level and or legislative support for what we're doing. And we are not shying away from engaging people who can make those things happen. But they need to be at the table right from the beginning, at least representatives. Not all the people that you will need will be in your coalition at the start of it. The other aspect that's, of course, really important is identifying common areas of need, interest, and motivation for both individuals and organizations. Why should they care about this coalition? And it's got to be because it's going to help them personally or in their work, or it's going to help their institution or their institution's mission. And the more you can align that with state needs, institutional needs, organizational needs, the more people you can get to the table who will devote time and energy and effort to this. I already mentioned the worthwhile aspects of collecting baseline data and developing a common vision and a shared agenda. These are things, again, that will evolve and continue to evolve over a multi-year period. But without those things about where you want to go, it's going to be very difficult for your coalition to be focused and to be successful. So this whole aspect of suspending reality and envisioning a world of 2030 really did allow us to have conversations we could not have had if we said, okay, here's the current reality of where we're at and where do we want to get to. Well, I can't get there because I'm constrained by my current reality. So again, find a way, think of mechanisms to create that vision of where you want to go in a common manner, not for your particular institution's self-interest, but for the good of students in your state or at your institution or multiple institutions. It's also really important to think about moving from this competition to this collaborative mode, and that requires creating trust and being inclusive. And those really go hand in hand. You really do want diverse voices at the table. You really want people who are somewhat skeptical to begin with about all of this. You do want people to voice some of their concerns, but for the most part, you want to bring up diverse creative ideas around this space. So although we're all interested in the Earth and space sciences, one of the questions is, what is the best mechanism for the Earth and space sciences to become an integral part of K-12 education, not just at middle schools and not just at a ninth grade, maybe Earth science class, or a few modules within elementary school, but how can it become a regular part? Well, part of that is through these conversations with other stakeholders and listening to what their needs are. Because right now in our state, the louder voices are in computer science and engineering. So we need to be partnering with them around models that reflect Earth, space science sorts of modeling, computer science algorithm development, engineering and geoengineering types of concepts that, again, allow for the implementation of the standards. One of the things you'll also realize and you'll want is to ask people to bring their resources to the table. This is part of moving away from competing to collaborating. I'm not sure I want to share all my great ideas and models, follow here. Our philosophy has been that we want to raise the boats for everybody, and that by sharing we can do that. And so bring your resources, we'll celebrate them and share them, and we'll make sure that your resources are looked at and valued as well as the ones that I bring to the table. Communicate. This is not a surprise, again, for everyone. One of the challenges of any organizational change effort, coalition building effort, is how to communicate regularly, clearly, and at multiple levels on a regular basis, and it's a challenge. And so thinking about your structure for how to manage communications, how to manage your coalition, how to build this kind of backbone organization that will support the work is important to consider as you're doing it. So don't forget that this will be an ongoing thing that you do throughout your coalition development. Another important component is have early wins. So by bringing people together, by realizing we had a lot to share, by realizing we each came away with something from each workshop, we realized that actually this was benefiting each of us. And then when we said, what we hope to do is out of this maybe put together a collaborative proposal for our entire state that we could get some funding to actually implement the things. And so that, again, was a nice incentive for people to think about how to work together so that resources could be made available to help us do these things. Again, common measurements to measure progress, and then this background support organization. So, kind of almost the last slide, the Earth and space science considerations here. So again, we're only a part of STEM. So to be effective in what we want to do and to make sure the NGSS really reflect Earth and space science core ideas and practices, et cetera, is we need to be good partners with our STEM colleagues. The second bullet here really reflects my history with this whole area of the first set of National Science Education Standards put out in 1996. And as Susan and I were talking about earlier before this started, the revolution in Earth and space science education that kind of came out of recognizing we were now equal players along with physics and biology and chemistry because of those standards, and then the sort of realization over time that being part of a document of standards does not make you more visible and more prominent in schools or in teacher preparation programs or necessarily anywhere. You have to really work on that organizational change at multiple levels within the system because we're not necessarily set up to support changes that reflect Earth and space science concepts. And I put the next bullet here about Appendix K in the Next Generation Science Standards, which are the model course maps in middle and high school. And they provide schools with a pathway for how you implement the standards. And if you look at the three models, the first is a conceptual progressions model, which in my mind truly embeds and reflects the intent of the standards, which is to be integrative, cross-disciplinary, three-dimensional in what you're trying to do. It's really concept-focused, and it's around big ideas. The science domains model reflects sort of a physical life and Earth and space science triumvirate, which is more of a middle school model right now, but certainly is not a high school model. And the last bullet there, the modified science domains model, biology, chemistry, and physics, is the current high school model for most places, including here in Washington. And our concern, as we've talked about this in the state, is that that is the path of least resistance for most of our high schools, is to say that's easiest for what we already do. We already teach those subjects. So sure, we'll integrate computer science, engineering, and earth and space science into our other courses. And the challenge will be, how can you do that and do that effectively? Because what will you give up content-wise in your own discipline to do? And if you go that direction, it will be very interesting to see which schools are actually effective in doing that and to what extent. The first model that we would like to encourage schools thinking about the NGSS to adopt is the conceptual model, because it requires us to really think about how students learn, and that it's not necessarily the best to teach in this siloed way that we do now. So this is what the NGS are proposing. They're trying to give schools a set of options. We should, I think, many of us be advocating for that first option there, because that will give us probably the greatest flexibility to actually have a strong presence within. And I'm talking particularly about the high school curriculum right now, which is a challenge for the teaching of earth and space science, unless you're in New York State. And recognizing, too, that partnering with our engineering computer science colleagues is probably a really smart thing to do, because they also know they are at the table, and they're trying to figure out where and how they will be present in schools. And the more we can partner and develop these integrative, collaborative, cross-disciplinary kinds of models that integrate these big ideas, the better off we'll all be. So the major take-home message here about the next generation science standards and the earth and space science component here is, first, advocate for next generation science standards actually being implemented or their equivalent in your state, because they provide you a lever and an opportunity around which you can build change and you can advocate for change. So, and as you do this, be very open to the fact that it will be uncomfortable in many ways for you and for your colleagues along some of these dimensions, and you will get resistance and pushback. But if you have your vision created, then it becomes easier to think about, if people buy into our vision, we now can create strategic action plans to move forward to reaching that vision. So these are some of the lessons, I think, that we want to take away as an earth and space science community. And I'll leave you with a few parting thoughts here, which is there is an opportunity provided by the standards for us, and it is really up to us to take advantage, because other people are also advocating for their own disciplines, and they will want to be part of that discussion as well. So the other thing is, create that shared vision within our community about how to do these things, how to partner effectively with others, how to build these coalitions, how to build a common vision and agenda so that we can share with one another to move forward in this area. We need to, all of us, be better at systems thinking and planning. So as earth system scientists and science educators, we have started to really think about systems in a very different way than when we went through school, many of us. But we're not necessarily good at applying systems thinking to our action plans and to our coalition building. And we need to do that. If you follow Peter Singe's work and Hal Hamilton and some of these other folks, They talk a lot about how you need to apply and can apply systems thinking to organizational change. And really focus on building collaborations at multiple levels and in multiple directions here based on your systems thinking. And around this whole aspect of next generation teachers and students. And finally, you're going to need to be committed to this. Anybody who wants to develop a coalition, it's a long-term proposition. It's going to take several years to develop and flesh out and charge this coalition with actually accomplishing something. And you have to have commitments from everybody in the coalition or their colleagues, which is why a broad tent works, because people come in and out of this, as I said earlier, but you need to have institutional and individual commitments for doing this over time to sustain these collaborations. And that's not easy to do given that everything else that's going on with people's lives. But it really is an important point if you really want these things to do what you would like, which is actually achieve something. I'll also leave you with one other thought here that we recognize is that having a timeline for accomplishing things, i.e. over the next 3 to 5 years, really puts then a real crystal clear expectation for people that we're not just going to get together to meet for the next 10 years and discuss things. We are going to accomplish things over the next 3 to 5 years. And whether we actually get funded from NSF to do this work in Washington, we will still continue to move forward based on the work we're doing. It's just additional resources will help us move forward more rapidly. So we have committed to actually doing this work. We just recognize that we will need to continue to commit to doing that if we really want the NGSS to actually be an opportunity rather than a lost opportunity for us in our Earth and Space Science community and in the STEM education community. And that's really it for today.
Thank you, Ed. That is an amazing, inspiring set of work that you're describing there. And I want to, we only have a few minutes for questions, and so I want to highlight a couple of the ones that are in the chat that are about some of the early things. I think many of us are recognizing, as you said, yes, if we compete with all of our brethren disciplines instead of collaborating, then we're just lost in the din, perhaps. So if you're just getting started on this kind of coalition, when Luis's question is, what were your early wins? What are the conditions for early success if you're just getting started?
So that's a great question. So one of it is having people come together with bringing what they want to accomplish. Okay? So come together to your first meeting with what is it that your needs are? What is it that's driving you to even bother to come to this workshop? And usually there's an urgent need or there's a set of urgent needs often. And it's like, we need to do these things and we don't really have the knowledge or expertise or resources just within our 2 or 3 or 4 people or 5 people at our institution who are really interested in these things to do this. So I'm hopeful that I'm going to come to this and find something that will help me. And when you set it up with come and share, and we actually had people do a SWOT analysis to begin with. So we had and they were hesitant at first, but when we shared what our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats were, it broke down barriers to, wow, we all have many of the same common strengths and weaknesses and opportunities. Oh, great, that's good to know. We all have common needs. And then we were able to share things that we were doing in these spaces. So from that first set of meetings and at each meeting thereafter, we had a sharing session to introduce people to resources that they could take away that could improve their programs, whether we did any other meetings or not. So each meeting we wanted to have people go away with things that they could share and that they could use at their own institutions and their own programs. And out of those first 3 sets of meetings and workshops, it then evolved into we built a lot of trust, we built a lot of ability to collaborate, and we recognized that we had a whole lot of other partners back at our own institutions that we would need to involve over time. But the first part was we will benefit by coming together and doing this work collaboratively.
Mm-hmm. There's several other questions. One is about motivation. And do you find that people are coming in and participating because of intrinsic motivation, or is there some other external motivation that they're accessing through this participation?
Yeah, so here in Washington, we have these different drivers, right? So we're an adoption state. All of our programs have to adopt and adapt our curricula and our teacher preparation programs to meet the new standards. So none of us have really done it fully yet, so wouldn't it be great to do that to begin with? So we have a STEM workforce need in our state that drives the missions of all of our institutions of higher education. So that was an incentive. We have diversity issues that are in common, and we're trying to create more diverse STEM majors and STEM teaching workforce. So we started to let people know these are the types of things we'd be discussing because we knew they would resonate both personally and with intrinsic motivations based on how the heck do I do this in my own program and in my own classes kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So each one of us in a state should be looking for those kinds of hot topics that's driving accountability for all the institutions.
Yep. Look for, because where that brings in is you again bring in partners that you wouldn't necessarily expect if it was all based about higher education. You can bring in people who've been in the legislature. You can bring in people who've worked in school districts. You can bring in people from informal science education communities who all have different perspectives to share, and they're really interested in the future of STEM teacher preparation. Even though they don't necessarily prepare teachers themselves, they have a vested interest, and particularly businesses have a strong vested interest in what we're doing. So recognize that their partners are out there, but think about what their incentives are.
And then I think one last question, because we're just over 3 o'clock, or my time, we're just over an hour. There's several questions in the chat about the intent when it comes to computer science. And I don't know if your coalition has addressed that, whether it's about coding, whether it's about using major platforms, whether it's about problem solving, thinking critically. Has your coalition addressed how that interfaces with Earth and space science?
Yeah, so we haven't directed that specific question of how it interfaces, but in general, we had legislation passed here last year that mandated greater teaching of computer science in our high schools. And so there aren't any endorsements on how to prepare teachers in computer science, so it's very haphazard right now. And it's not just about coding. It's about, at the early levels, it's about things like computational thinking, algorithmic thinking. There is exposure to coding, but it's about modeling. It's about the things that computer science does. And in our context that we talked about, and we talked a little bit in terms of things like climate change, et cetera, it is around how do you help students build simple models? And how can you use computers to help you do that? How can you learn simple types of coding? What we shared was that there are some fairly simple coding organizations, platforms, like in our state, code.org, that introduce students. But right now, in the next year, we'll be looking at what those intersections are between computer science and earth science, and computer science and mathematics, and computer science and physics, because what we're trying to do is develop these models for how that would actually play out in classrooms, because our in-service teachers don't know how to do this either. And the same goes really for engineering, is what are the models? So we are now actively looking for people engaged in computer science education and engineering education to partner with us and provide professional development so that it can inform this integration of these disciplines.
Very nice. Thank you so much for sharing this, Ed.
Thank you all.
And I look forward to seeing what's coming out of it, and I think you were one of the early adopters and continue to blaze the trail.
Yep. Well, I look forward to what everybody else ends up doing in this space, too, because we want to learn from you.
Right. Okay, so thank you, Ed, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to remind you of these upcoming events and to look for more webinars when we start back up in the fall. Please remember that this is recorded and will be archived if you'd like to share it with anybody else, any of your colleagues. And if you have any ideas for future topics, if you'd like to present something on your own work, Please feel free to contact us at my email there, susan.sullivan@colorado.edu, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you, everybody.